Hello my dear friends, you're in the Military Summary channel, and today we'll discuss the situation in the world on the 4th of July of 2026. Today we have a lots of very interesting updates, so let's start. And first we're going to talk about the conflict on the territory of Ukraine, where the Russians during the previous 24 hours have improved their positions significantly along the entire line of combat contact. So let's start and let's talk first of all about the northern directions, about the Votkinsk area, where the Russians, according to the Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation and according to the group of forces north, managed to take under complete control two villages. We are talking about the settlements of Losivka and Zemlyanoy Yar. And these are the changes on the ground between the dates. So this is the end of the 3rd of July of 2026. Most of these territories used to be considered as a gray zone or infiltrated territories, but today we received confirmations from the Russian side that as a result of clashes they managed to take both villages under complete control. As for the settlement of Losivka, the Russians right now are focused to improve and to secure their flanks before moving further deep inside of the northeastern parts of the Kharkiv region. The Russians most likely will continue offensive operation in this area further in the southern direction, but the Russians are not going to move in the southern direction very fast. As of now, the Russians are tasked to establish complete control over the settlement of Belyi Kolodiaz, and according to the Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation, the village of Zemlyanoy Yar was taken by Russians. This morning they announced about this during another report of the Minister of Defense and the group of forces north. And as you can see, the distances between the settlements of Zemlyanoy Yar and Belyi Kolodiaz is already less than 500 meters, which means that most likely first sabotage and reconnaissance groups of the armed forces of the Russian Federation have already entered the settlement of Belyi Kolodiaz, and I believe that the clashes are taking place through the settlement itself already. And if Ukrainians lose control over the settlement of Belyi Kolodiaz, and if Russians are able to establish complete control over this part of the northeastern part of the Kharkiv region, this would lead to complete collapse of the most northeastern parts of the Kharkiv region. We're talking about these territories, and obviously under the pressure of the armed forces of the Russian Federation, the Ukrainians would be forced to fall back further in the southern direction, first of all towards the settlement of Veliki Burluk. This is the next stage of the battle for the northeastern parts of the Kharkiv region. We're talking about this territory, and if Ukrainians lose control over the settlement of Veliki Burluk, the Ukrainians would be forced to fall back in the direction of the settlements of Pechenegi and Shevchenkova. But I would like to remind you that these days the Russians continue their offensive operation not just through the settlements of Belyi Kolodiaz and Losivka and so on. According to the group of forces north, currently there are very heavy clashes in the area of the settlements of Petropavlovka, Mitrofanovka, in the area of the villages of Kolodiaz near Grigorovka. So the Russians are pushing Ukrainians from the east as well, trying to take on the complete control the most northeastern parts of the Kharkiv region. And I would like to remind you that during the first stage of the special military operation, these territories were already under Russian control in 2022, but during the fall of 2022, the Ukrainians, as a result of the Kharkiv counter-offensive operation, managed to recapture all these territories, and now we see that the Russians are trying to return these territories back under the Russian control. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation along the river of Oskol, and the most important updates of the previous 24 hours are coming from the Barove Pocket. During the previous several days, the Russians improved their positions significantly. For example, this is the situation by the end of the 2nd of July of 2026. This is the situation by the end of the 3rd of July of 2026. During the previous 48 hours, the Russians published lots of updates about the situation in this area. For example, in this video that was published yesterday during the 3rd of July of 2026, we can see how the Russians were fighting for the settlements of Druzhkivka and Chernishina. And here in this video we can see at least several places where the Russian soldiers were located and where the Russians were raising their flags. Yesterday we have adjusted and we have cut completely this pocket. And today during the 4th of July of 2026, the Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation, the group of of Forces West published additional updates about the situation in this area. The Russians reported that the settlement of Novy Mir, the settlement of Druzhkivka, the settlement of Cherneshina, and the settlement of Shyikivka are already under complete Russian control. So let's take a look at this video that was published by Russians today. Here we can see how the clashes for these villages were taking place through the Barove Pocket, and in the final part of this video we can see flags, we can see the Russian flags through these territories. We haven't adjusted the territory of Shyikivka because this report was published right before we started making this video, and the Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation also published a video about the situation in this area. We will analyze this video, and probably tomorrow before the next update we will adjust the map and we will color these territories under complete Russian control. So as you can see, the news around this the Barove Pocket is tightening. The Ukrainians lose the ground in this area, and at some point the Ukrainians would be forced to begin retreating further in the southwestern direction towards the settlements of Oskol and Izyum, with the purpose to organize defenses along the rivers of Oskol and Seversky Donetsk in this area. But we believe that by the moment when the Ukrainians retreat from these territories, and by the moment the Russians finish the battle for the entire Barove Pocket, we believe that the Russians would make several attempts to cross the river Oskol with the purpose to attack the Ukrainians in the area of the City of Izyum from the north. According to different sources, since the beginning of 2024 and 2025, and during the 2025 and 2026, the Ukrainians were improving their defenses around the cities of Oskol and Izyum significantly, building a dense network of the fortifications. So we can say that the city of Izyum is a very important and well-fortified territory where the Ukrainians would try to stop the Russians, and where the Ukrainians would try not to allow the Russians to outflank the Slavinsk-Konstantinovka agglomeration from behind, and to outflank the city of Kharkiv from the south as well. So most likely during this second part of 2026, and probably during the late 2026, we may see the third battle for the city of Izyum. The first two battles for the city took place during the 2022, and it seems that during the late 2026 or early 2027, the third battle for the city is going to take place. And as of the city of Izyum, according to information we have, there is a strategical elevation in this area, the highest point between the cities of Slaviansk and Kharkiv, and who controls these highest points are able to control lots of territories around. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation in the area of the city of Lyman. As of the previous 24 hours, the Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation haven't reported anything on the matter about the situation in this area. We have just a regular report where the Russians reported that additional buildings were secured by Russians, that the Russians continued advancing further, and that the battle for the city of Lyman is coming to its end. And we believe that the Russians decided to cut the number of villages captured by Russians into several batches. So you know that during the 7th and 8th of July of 2026, a NATO summit is going to take place on the territory of Ankara in Turkey, where the Western countries, the United States of America, the NATO countries, Ukraine, will decide what to do next and how the Western countries and Ukraine are able to stop the Russians. And according to information we have, the Western countries are going to provide a lot of money to Ukraine. The sources reported about billions of euros. NATO will allocate 70 billion to Ukraine at the Ankara summit. The publication reports that at the summit, countries will approve an additional 70 billion euro in aid to Kiev, as well as commitment to maintain support at least at an equivalent level in 2027. So which means that Kiev will get lots of money during this summit. So that is why we believe, and as usual, this is something like a pattern, this is something like a signature. Almost every time before any NATO summit, the Russians, and both the Russians and the Ukrainians, are trying to show significant results on the ground. The Russians are tasked to show the NATO countries that all these allocations and all these fundings and all this financial aid to Ukraine is useless, and the Ukrainians from their side are trying also to show that they have strong cards also before any NATO summit that took place have taken place since the beginning of the special military operation, also with the purpose to show the Western countries and the NATO countries that their investments change the situation, that the Ukrainians improve their positions, and so on and so on. So due to the fact that the NATO summit is going to take place within the next basically 2 days, this means that most likely during the next 2 days the Russians will report more updates about changes on the ground, and we believe that maybe tomorrow during the 5th of July of 2026 or during the 6th of July the Russians will announce complete control over the city of Lyman, or the Russians will announce complete control over the cities of Orikhiv and Preobrazhenka, because the Minister of Defense and the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of the Russian Federation today reported that the clashes are already taking place through these two cities and through the entire Orikhiv agglomeration. And as for the Ukrainian side, during the previous 24 hours, they made an attempt to make their cards stronger, and the Ukrainians attacked deep inside of the theater of Russia using hundreds of drones. The sources reported that the Ukrainians attacked the city of St. Petersburg, and the Ukrainians were trying to hit the St. Petersburg oil terminal, and the terminal was hit, but the damage is minimal. Furthermore, the Ukrainians attacked deep inside of the theater of Russia. The Ukrainians were trying to attack the settlement of Votkinsk, but pro-Ukrainian sources reported that every single Flamingo-type missile was brought down and intercepted by Russians. As for the settlement of Votkinsk, we have this military enterprise, and this is the main military enterprise where Russians produce Iskander missiles. So the Ukrainians were trying before the NATO summit to attack this military enterprise and to have as much as possible strong cards before this event. And it seems that the Ukrainians were trying to attack in the direction of the southern regions, and we have several videos from the area of the settlements of Berdyansk and Stavropol. As for the Stavropol, we have this video where we can see some black smoke over the settlement, and the sources reported that the Ukrainians attacked another military enterprise on the territory of the settlement, but as of the end of the 4th of July, it's very difficult to say. Anyway, we see that both the Russians and the Ukrainians are trying to make stronger cards before the beginning of the NATO summit, and this is not the end. Obviously, during the next several days, we'll see more updates. Furthermore, the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, Syrskyi, stated today that the Russians began the preparation of the next massive attack that also might happen right before the NATO summit starts. So probably between the 5th and the 6th, probably yes, tomorrow, between Sunday and Monday, the Russians will carry out another massive attack using this time hundreds of drones. The Russians haven't used drones almost at all during the previous massive attack, so the Russians saved their capabilities to make another strike, which means that right before the NATO summit starts, the Russians may carry out another massive attack through the territory of Ukraine. So anyway, let's wait and see how the things are going to develop next, but now let's continue with the Kostiantynivka agglomeration. As we discussed during the previous video, the Russians, as a result of clashes, established complete control over the settlement of Kostiantynivka. As you can see, I have covered with my cursor this icon of flag, and you can see right now lots of icons with flags were highlighted, and every single icon with flag that was highlighted is the place, the point on the territory of the city of Kostiantynivka where the Russians raised the flag either of the Russian unit or of the Russian Federation or of the Russian unit that was responsible or involved in the battle for the city of Kostiantynivka. Lots of flags were raised through the city. By the way, today both Zelensky and the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, Syrskyi, rejected that the Russians managed to take on the complete control of the city of Kostiantynivka. They say that the Russians sent forces on the territory of the city, but the Ukrainians almost every single time the Russians send units, the Ukrainians find them and force the Russians to fall back. So according to the Ukrainian reality, the city of Kostiantynivka still remains almost under complete Ukrainian control without even a single position of the armed forces of the Russian Federation through the city. So this is the situation. We used to see the same thing with the cities of Pokrovsk and Mirnograd. The Russians announced control over the both cities, Pokrovsk and Mirnograd, somewhere in the end of 2025, but the Ukrainians confirmed the loss of both cities only probably somewhere in April or May of 2026, so maybe 4 or 5 months after. So we believe that the same situation will be with the city of Kostiantynivka, and very likely that if the city of Kostiantynivka was lost by the Ukrainians, they would confirm this only when the Russians will approach the southern parts of the city of Kramatorsk. So we shouldn't expect that the pro-Ukrainian sources will adjust their maps very fast. At the same time, pro-Russian sources stated that first sabotage and reconnaissance groups have already entered the settlement of Alexeyevo-Druzhkivka, and that the clashes began 4 days city on the way towards the settlement of Druzhkivka. So the Russians, as we can see, managed to improve their cards as strong as possible before the NATO summit. Now let's move further and let's talk about the Dobropillia direction. The Russians confirmed the presence of Russians on the territory of the city of Dobropillia itself. During the previous 24 hours, we haven't received anything. We're talking about videos, but once again, the NATO summit will start only on the 7th of July, which means that maybe tomorrow or the day after tomorrow, pro-Russian sources will publish first videos with flags through the city of Dobropillia as well. And I believe that this is going to happen. During the next 2-3 days, the Russians will try to create the situation that everything is under the Russian control and that the Russians are advancing along the entire line of combat contact, starting from the Zaporizhzhia area till the area of the city of Sumy. As for the territories a bit further to the south, today the Russians improved their positions through the settlement of Vasilivka, and these are the changes on the ground between the dates. This is the end of the 2nd of July, this is the end of the 3rd of July, and this is the end of the 4th of July. The Russians confirmed control over the territory, and we have a video where we can see how the Russians were moving through the settlement of Vasilivka further in the northwestern direction. So we have lots of proofs that the Russians managed to improve their positions through this area as well. As for the Zaporizhzhia direction, during the previous 12 hours, we haven't received anything on the maps of videos or changes on the ground. The Minister of Defense reported that the clashes for the settlement of Pokrovsk begins, but once again, I believe that during the next 2-3 days, the Russians will announce several more villages under their control, and among these villages could be the villages from the Zaporizhzhia direction. The Russians may say something about the settlement of Velika Mikhailovka, because today the Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation stated that the clashes began on the territory of the village itself. So it's something like a signal that the Russian troops might be already through the settlement of Velika Mikhailovka. So that is why we might expect that in coming hours before the NATO summit, the Russians may announce control over this settlement. This is a possible situation. Furthermore, today the Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation also stated that the clashes continue for the settlements of Orikhiv and Prymorsk, and also before the NATO summit we might see another big video, long video from the Russian side with dozens of flags raised through the entire eastern directions, through the entire Zaporizhzhia and Dnipropetrovsk direction. So everything is possible. So as of the 4th of July, this is the dates of the territories and changes between Dobropillia and Kharkiv area. Probably tomorrow on the 5th of July, the Russians will shift their focus to the Zaporizhzhia and Dnipro direction, and maybe during the 6th of July, the Russians will announce about additional changes on the ground through the Sumy and Chernigov direction, because there are also chances that the Russians, before the beginning of the NATO summit, may announce additional changes on the ground and through the northern parts of the Chernigov region to make their cards as strong as possible before NATO organizations and the Western organization announce additional military aid and support to Ukraine. Once again, as for the Ukrainian side, they reject every single statement made by Russians about additional changes on the ground, especially concerning the city of Kiev. Zelensky rejects any idea that the settlement of Kiev is under complete Russian control, and Zelensky made a very interesting statement on this matter. He said that now, on the eve of America's Independence Day, Putin has decided to lie to the world and the President of America about the situation on the front. He claims that the Russians have supposedly captured Kostiantynivka in Donbass. Of course, this is not true. It's just another Russian lie to launch some kind of news. If Kostiantynivka is now under Russian control, then presumably Putin will have no problem meeting me there and finding diplomatic solution to finally end the war. But he still won't cross the front line. The truth is very different from Putin's words. These are the statements that were made by the President of Ukraine, Zelensky, this evening on the 4th of July, right after the Russians announced about complete control over the city of Kostiantynivka. From the other side, the Russians also made a statement to Zelensky and to Ukraine, and the Russians, more precisely the Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation, proposed to the Ukrainian side a ceasefire through the city of Kostiantynivka during the 6th of July of 2026, somewhere between 2 and 6 p.m. probably, and the Russians are saying that the ceasefire the Ukrainians can use for their soldiers, for false soldiers, for evacuation of them. So the Russians are saying that lots of soldiers of the armed force, fallen soldiers of the armed force Ukraine, are located and will remain on the territory of the city. So this is the step from the Russian side. Anyway, let's wait and see how the things are going to develop. But one thing is clear, that's most likely during the upcoming nights, the Ukrainians will repeat massive and deep inside long-range strikes through the entire territory of the Russian Federation, just with one purpose: to make as strong as possible their cards before the beginning of the NATO summit. And that's it for today. For the Military Summary channel remains to condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for your watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes to my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye-bye.